Well, welcome once again to the Expert Spotlight podcast, where we explore the power of strategic marketing and branding and business growth. If you're looking to grow your professional practice or your business, you're in the right place. My name is Gordon Van Wechel. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by what I think is going to be a really exciting guest, particularly because the topic is so timely, and that's Meagan Kirchner. Meagan is the founder of the Kirchner Law firm, and they handle most of the facets of immigration law. So, Meagan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a fun discussion. But, before we jump into all the nuances of what's happening today, give us a little bit of your background, how you happen to come to the law or specialize in immigration law.
Sure. Grew up in a rural area, a lot of farms, a lot of orchards near me. So I was, pretty exposed early on to, the different facets of, cultural immersion and how people come to, the different areas. I always had a fascination with my minor in undergrad was international affairs and always been interested in the law. So decided to go to law school. And during that time, I worked in the office of the Judge Advocate General at the Navy Yard in DC, doing human resources, which worked well with business, and decided, that was the last kick I needed to go to law school. I went to law school in Northern Virginia, so very diverse area, and just happened upon immigration. I'd been pretty focused on human resources and business law. And that actually, there's a lot of facets of that kind of dovetails into the immigration. So it kind of allowed me to marry the two interests, right? International affairs, business, and HR. So have even before I graduated law school, started working in immigration and have worked at small boutique firms as well as, the big law firms where there's hundreds of attorneys, all specializing in immigration. I've worked in the alphabet soup of non-immigrant immigrant visas. We could go down that rabbit hole and all the different kinds I've worked on, but focused primarily on business immigration for over 10 years now.
And your practice is still in Northern Virginia?
No, my practice is now remote, but I am located about an hour outside south of Charlottesville, but do have clients all around the country because immigration is a federal practice.
Yeah. And the world is flat
Yeah,
with the internet.
more today than ever.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you work with business immigration. Talk about some of your typical clients. Who do you work with? How do they find you? What's their objective?
Yeah, so that question varies widely depending on what kind of immigration they're looking for. I do a large chunk of my practice right now. I've kind of niched down into the H-2 program, which is your agricultural visas and your blue collar, unskilled. That's your hospitality, landscaping, construction, restaurants. So a lot of the businesses that reach out to me are doing seasonal labor. So it's temporary. Muddled in there is, one-time need as well as like nannies and caretakers. So that can be, that's a much smaller percentage. Many people, aren't familiar with the programs. They're more familiar with, your tech visas. I also have clients that work in that space. Your engineers and doctors and things like that. And so most of my business comes from referrals. I've got a pretty wide network after being in the industry for so long. But I also make a lot of connections with networking. I heavily rely on, social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Reddit, all of those things just to kind of get information out there, bolster credibility. I do a lot of podcasts and try to submit articles and blogs here and there as well. And that really, gets information out there that people can use and starts conversations. I have a smaller subset of practice that will do, I'd say I'm, 99% business, but I will get local organic outreach from my website, just so people that are in, a few hours or in Virginia that will reach out for maybe they need naturalization or they married a U.S. citizen and they need to sponsor their spouse or something like that. Those are, I do handle and have done in the past, but they're not something I usually advertise just because it's not the bulk of my business. But I do get local outreach from that as well.
Hmm. Let me ask a personal question. I have a manager who works for us in northern India. She's been with me for, I think, almost 7 years now. Really does an expert job at managing paid advertising campaigns. And several years ago, she was single and she was looking to relocate. And, so I contacted an immigration attorney here. I'm also in Virginia. I'm in the Virginia Beach area. And, he painted a pretty bleak picture that unless she had some very unique skill set that couldn't possibly be duplicated by someone here in the US, which means that's nearly impossible,
Right.
there was no way to get her a visa to work, even though we could guarantee a job.
Right. That
Was that a different kind of visa or?
that would they were probably looking at an H-1B visa for that, which is far more difficult to prove in your business degree kind of categories like marketing, business administration, business management, all of those kinds of degrees can be difficult to prove in the H-1B context because, in that context, the job and the individual need to qualify. So in that case,
Hmm.
the job would need to require a particular degree and not, be so broad that you can really train someone to do it. Or maybe someone could be an engineer, but they can learn marketing, something like that.
Sure.
So it's much more difficult to sponsor someone with with a position that really could be used in multiple degrees. Obviously there are positions that maybe it's normal in the industry to require a specific degree like marketing. It's just definitely a heavier lift to prove on the government side that actually requires that specific degree. So that is certainly a challenge that a lot of people face, is that they need a particular skill set, but the government has left there's a gap, right, and filling that need, because the government has deemed it needs to be specialized in some way.
So probably what I should have done is tried to bring her in as a nanny because that would have had a.
No, not necessarily, because the program I work with is riddled with all kinds of other bureaucracy and red tape and issues with 30-year-old numerical limits on the visas that they issue that haven't changed. The economy and industries have changed dramatically. And the workforce composition has changed so much in 25 or 30 years, but the number of visas that are available in particular categories is static. So there's no correction on the government side for issuing these visas or making new categories or whatever the case may be, so that it's much more difficult to actually acquire them.
So what it does though is it gives you a lot of work.
Right. It makes it provides me a job to do, but it also doesn't make it easy because there are so
Yeah.
many gray areas.
Yeah.
Like everything in law, really, but there's
Yeah.
no black and white necessarily.
Not anymore. Not anymore. So typically when you start with a case, how long does it take to actually get a person through all of the steps and the paperwork and?
It varies so widely depending on what kind of case type you're looking at. I mean, if you're looking at a green card case, an employer sponsoring a particular worker and you need a labor certification from the Department of Labor, I mean, that's a years and years and years. The Department of Labor steps alone can take 2 years, if not more. And then because of those numerical limits I was talking about a minute ago, you could be approved as a business to sponsor this particular individual, but the consulate can't take that last step to issue them a green card or immigrant visa because of backlogs and lack of numbers for the visa. So, you could go through 3 years of the process and then not be able to finish it. So some cases, if you're married and you're ready to file for your spouse and they're here in the US already and you need to adjust status, you know, me just filing the case, I can prepare it in a couple of weeks sometimes. But getting to that last step where they get the benefit they're applying for, it could be months or it could be years. There's such a wide spread depending on the visa type, category, where they're from, where the beneficiary is from matters. There's country limits as well. So again, not a very gray. There's not a concrete answer for many of these questions.
I have another situation that might be of interest. We have a CPA client who has several tax preparers who are in the Philippines. And, they have the equivalent of a CPA degree in the Philippines, and they've worked with her for a couple of years now. And last fall, she thought that, well, maybe we'll bring the ladies, there's three ladies, maybe we'll bring the ladies over to the US for several months during tax season so we can refine their training. And that was the goal. So we started the process with the consulate in the Philippines, and we got a really interesting response. Two of the ladies are married with families, the other one is single. And based on what the person in the consulate office told us, it was going to be nearly impossible to get this single lady a visa because they were concerned that she would never want to go home again. Is
That
that
is
something that
certainly a
you encounter?
possibility. And that varies consulate to consulate. Some consulates, it's difficult to get people approved. South Africa is another one.
Hmm.
I had a client trying to bring a caregiver over from South Korea last year, and they made it through all of the USCIS process. They were approved to, as a company or as a household employer, to sponsor someone for the visa. They had gone through this whole process, and ultimately, when the worker went through the consulate denied the worker because, again, they found that the worker had better opportunity there, and the pay wasn't enough for them to go there, even though the pay was what the government, Immigration Services and Department of Labor had said was a fair wage for the position. So, um, it was the consulate can make broad decisions with very little transparency. There's specific codes they can or regulations they can cite as to why they're rejected. Um, but often they're very broad, and you'll get more information from that the officer has talked with the applicant, that doesn't necessarily align with what's on the paper, or so it can be, it's a very difficult process, and it boils down to so many variables with each agency you're working with, and even right down to the last step in the officer that's reviewing the final interview.
Hmm. It almost seems like when you actually get someone across the finish line, it's cause for a huge celebration.
you know, I think more people should celebrate than they do, because it really is, because of so many things that can go wrong, and for no reason. Oftentimes legally it can be perfect and it can still go awry. There's an individual element to it with the broad discretion that officers get both at the consulate and immigration services. So it certainly is cause for celebration.
So I know it may not be your direct specialty, but there's so much going on with immigration in the news these days. What's your perspective as an attorney that's on the front lines?
It is becoming very difficult to advise clients in a just by the letter of the law. There's so many things that are changing and fluid, or just happening, at CBP, at border entrances, or at airports. There's things, that we could never have predicted what would happen, right? So, the uptick in reviewing, people entering the country, reviewing their phones, looking at their social media, students that are here on visas that are being scrutinized and having their social media histories checked and visas revoked based on activism, or things that may have happened that otherwise in prior years wouldn't have impacted their visa. So um, it is a very challenging time, and I find myself cautioning clients, kind of in the abstract. It's not a comfortable position to be in as an attorney, because you don't want, you have to have a caveat with every conversation you have. Oh, as it stands today,
Hmm.
this will be fine. However, in 6 months, perhaps not. We
Yeah.
really can't predict the future with the new administration, and trying to learn where their stance is, what their patterns are going to be, what changes they may make. So it's a challenging time to properly advise clients. No, with myself not even knowing what the future may hold.
Yeah. Well, you've been practicing through several administrations now. Do you find that there's a flip flop as a new administration comes in? The law may not change, but the interpretation sure does.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I did practice under the first iteration of the current administration, and certainly, coming from Obama, that was, every administration is difficult in some way, but certainly when it shifted in 2016, there was an uptick in what we call requests for evidence, or notices of intent to deny. It became more challenging to get it right the first time, right? Even if you were submitting an identical application to what you would have submitted months before,
Hmm.
maybe there's new questions now, or even what they're asking may shift. There may be a push for um, having issues with a certain one part of the regulation this year, and then next year there's a different part that's, you're seeing a trend of what RFEs look like, right? They may have a certain flavor to them. There may be a recurring theme, a topic that they're looking at. And you kind of shift and front load your documentation to try and preclude an RFE because you're expecting this particular question to happen, and those absolutely shift between administrations. So the questions that are asked may shift, as well as the frequency with which you have issues with applications. That certainly changes at immigration services, and even at the consulate. You may have different issues come up on interviews, or again more secondary screening or more administrative processing that can happen at the consulate. So it's certainly something where you kind of adjust your practice and adjust your practices and documentation as you see trends arise. And that's where um, much like many other industries, it's very important to stay involved and connected to the industry. So I remember the AILA, the American Immigration Law Association, and it helps us stay up to date on trends and adjudication and practices and policies and changes. And I'm also a member of the one visa that I heavily practice on is like I said, the agricultural and unskilled labor or seasonal labor area, where I keep close ties to the lobbying group in that area, because they are very keyed into the DHS liaison and the White House liaison, and kind of can see behind closed doors what's happening, and make sure that even social media, like seeing what's happening with other attorneys. It's very important to know what's happening beyond what's in the news. Otherwise, you're going to miss those small trend changes and important information that your client could maybe benefit from if you're keeping an eye on what's happening in the industry.
You certainly seem to be keeping a lot of balls in the air.
Yes.
Well, I think we've had a pretty good understanding now of, your professional practice and certainly your experience and qualifications. I want to switch now to something a little more personal, and we're going to play what I like to call the lightning round.
Okay.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question, and I just want you to respond with the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
Okay? Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
What's one business tool or asset that you just couldn't live without?
Ooh. Oh, I say email just because that's how I keep in touch with all of my clients. But I mean, that's so generic, but it's true.
Well, it's a tool we all use, so yeah,
Right.
hundreds of times a day, it seems.
Right.
What's your favorite quote or phrase about success?
An Eleanor Roosevelt quote: "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams," or something along those lines. So, there was a 10th grade assignment for your epitaph, and that was what I picked. I may have botched the exact wording, but that's the spirit of it.
Yeah, got it. Uh, what's one bucket list item that you've already accomplished?
Um, Starting my own business.
Yeah, big one. What's a mistake you've made that has turned into a valuable lesson, a valuable asset for you today?
Um, that's a tough one. I think that one of my regrets was not, going into, I don't know if it's a mistake, but my major in college was going to be international affairs, and a minor in Spanish so that I could learn Spanish and be fluent. And that definitely would have benefited me today. But if I hadn't gone the business route and, gotten the internships I got, I may not have ultimately gone into law. So it's ultimately worked out. And I still utilize and stay true to the spirit of my initial interests, but, just a little different in a little different way.
Yeah. Last question. If you could give one piece of business advice to your younger self, what would it be?
Take risks sooner.
Take risks sooner. It's a common response. And finally, Meagan, if our listeners want to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
If they have LinkedIn, that's a good way to connect and follow my content. But if they want to reach out for a consultation, my phone number or email is the best. Meagan at KirchnerImmigration.com. Phone number 434-226-0586.
Great. And we'll make sure those are in the show notes as well.
Sure.
Thanks so much, Meagan, for
Yeah.
sharing your time with us. Your insights, I think, are really timely. And
Yes.
I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience will as well.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. So that's it for this episode of the Expert Spotlight podcast, where each week we talk with business leaders who are making a difference. Until next time, then, this is Gordon Van Wechel wishing you success.